So I want to jump right into our research priorities session, and I'll go through these, and then we'll ask Marshall Jacobson and Wib Owen to give some initial feedback on that and open it up for anybody else that would like to say anything. Again, the idea here is that we surveyed our stakeholders earlier this year, late last year, with the idea of better understanding where their research priorities were and how those fit with what PINEMAP was doing and how they would like to see research delivered to their organizations. We tried to hit the diversity of organizations doing Southern Pine management, so TMOs, REITs, manufacturing, public land management, large private landowners. And so for the corporate piece, we sent the survey out to about 130 people, and about half of those sent surveys back. We had a separate but very similar survey that went out to more non-corporate extension-focused people and had sort of a similar number of surveys sent out in return. So we had, I think, a nice set of responses from a cross-section of our stakeholders. And these surveys were intended, again, to look at the PINEMAP research that is in place and to understand, for instance, which pieces of those were of a special interest to our stakeholders so that we can understand how best to then extend those particular pieces or elements of PINEMAP research to them, to understand how to get that information to our stakeholders. Obviously, we've been doing tech transfer and extension for a long time, and there's some very well-established models for how to do that, and we're not intending in any way to throw those away. So we sort of said, okay, here is the models that we've been operating under. How well do you think those will work for some of the things PINEMAP is doing, and are there some other things we can do? So we'll talk about that later when we talk about outreach, but we're going to start with some of the research priorities and some of the things that our stakeholders identified as being important. So this is a sort of a demographic table of our respondents combined from those two surveys. Actually, this is just the corporate survey. I apologize. So it's listed by organization type. I think all of you know there are not 17 timber REITs out there. These are the number of individuals that responded. So obviously in many cases there were multiple individuals per organization that responded. I know Paul and Marshall never agree on anything, so we needed to hear from both of them, for instance, to get a feel for where Plum Creek was. So really a nice diversity of stakeholders, a wide range of ownership sizes with good representation, I think, from across the spectrum of land ownership, but obviously really representing a lot of acres of southern pine in the region. So I'm going to jump right into some of these results. All of the stakeholders received a summary of these results several weeks ago. So I'm sort of going to highlight some of those results here. And they're color-coded, and I'll try to walk you through how that color coding worked. So we have this green color coding, which is associated with the corporate stakeholders, and this orangish color associated with the non-corporate stakeholders. Again, we were asking them to respond to very similar questions. And this first part was focused on impacts of climate variability and climate change. We asked the corporate folks, how important is research in these different areas for your organization? For the non-corporate folks, we said, how important is it to incorporate knowledge from these pieces into your programs, into your education and extension programming? So similar questions, but the focus was slightly different. So just to orient you here, we have, again, this is the impact slide. So a number of research areas associated with potential impacts of climate change on growth and productivity, on phenology, on invasives, and so on. So all those research topics are on the left side. And then on the right side are the responses. And basically what we've done is we've tallied what percentage of the respondents for each element said that element was important or very important. So a number 4 or a number 5 on a Likert importance scale. So these are sort of the things that if it's a high percentage, then a high percentage of those respondents thought a particular thing was important or very important for their organization. So we have those responses both for the research cooperative or the corporate respondees as well as the non-corporate respondees. The results are sorted by percentage for the corporate respondees. So the ranking there is in terms of the corporate response. There's some concurrence in many areas, but in some areas there were some differences. So the colored part basically highlights the areas where 50% or more of the respondents for a stakeholder group identified an element as being important or very important. And then we've highlighted, in this case, the top 3 in red for each of those groups. So, a couple of things we can point out here. Some of them probably not terribly surprising. The corporate respondees very much, pretty much without exception, were interested in the impacts of climate change and variability on productivity, but also interested in timber supply. Whereas probably the highest number of folks in the non-corporate respondees were interested in invasive species and the impacts of climate change on invasives. Those non-corporate folks were also interested in impacts of climate change on magnitude of insect and disease outbreaks. Not to discount, obviously, that some of the corporate, large number of the corporate landowners were also interested. Maybe the biggest disparity between the two groups in these areas was in terms of extreme weather events. The non-corporate stakeholders, a large number of them identified things like lightning, hurricanes, drought, and so on as being really important for their organizations, less so from some of the corporate landowners. And this is really a fascinating data set to dig into, and we could probably stand here at this slide for 20 minutes and sort of dissect why some of these are important for a group or another and why there are contrasts. But so it really is a fascinating look into priorities, but we don't have time to do that. But I think there's some real concurrence. Obviously there is an agreement on a number of these topics. Productivity, timber supply, land value, and land use are important for both groups. So I think those are important results to look at. We also had a series of questions associated with sort of more specific silvicultural responses. So PINEMAP is focused on helping to prepare people to respond to changing and variable climate. So to what extent is your organization interested in research on these particular management or silvicultural activities? Now, it's a big list. This is sort of almost anything you might imagine in terms of management in silviculture. But again, there is some correspondence among the groups. The top 2 elements for the corporate landowners in this area were not specifically silviculture, but were related to deployment of genetics. So planting genotypes that are suited to resistant to drought, insects, or disease, and also breeding for enhanced yield. So it's interesting that those turned up in terms of really high preponderance of people that highlighted those. Both the corporate and non-corporate stakeholders were really interested in silvicultural techniques that promote forest productivity and vigor. And I think there's obviously a broad understanding that managing forests well and managing forests for productivity is really probably the foundational step in terms of managing for resilience. You know, we can think about out-of-the-box management techniques and new approaches to managing forests, but it really all starts with creating and managing vigorous, healthy stands. So that ends up being identified as a really important element, and I think we can all agree on that. But there are a lot of other elements that obviously are important. Fertilization is of great interest to corporate landowners, much less so to non-corporate landowners who in many cases are very resource limited and don't often fertilize. Both groups are very interested in managing for forest insects and disease. That was a high priority. Again, the sort of invasive species question popped up as being a very high priority for the non-corporate landowners, and maybe slightly less of a priority for the corporate folks. So again, some interesting contrasts between the groups, but a lot of similarities as well. I think there were a few elements pointed out as important for non-corporate folks that seemed to have low priority for the corporate people in terms of adjusting harvest scheduling and sanitation cuts, for instance. Those were of little interest to some of our corporate stakeholders. So I realize this is a lot of information, and especially for sort of some of the PINEMAP team, many of whom have not seen the reporting on this, and you'll have opportunities to see more of this. But again, the stakeholders in the room have seen summaries of these before as well, so we're just highlighting those. Another area that we asked about was areas related to assessments and modelings and projections and so on. And there were some interesting results here. I think some of these areas did not light people up as much. So assessment of future productivity on forest land being considered for acquisition or sale. So a smaller number of the corporate folks identified that as being a high priority. And there's probably a number of reasons that that might be a low priority. I'm sure some of them are already confident that they already have the information they need to do that adequately. The non-corporate folks did identify that as being important. Some of these other areas, economic impacts of climate variability and change, access to climate data and future climate projections. There was a pretty low apparent interest in some of that. And information or models for participating in carbon model markets. Obviously, very low priority right now because there are very few opportunities right now to participate in carbon markets. As a side note, I think much of what we're doing in PINEMAP is important in terms of productivity, and we're going to produce lots of useful information. But I think should carbon markets become viable in the future, we also will have some very good tools in our back pockets that all of you can use to capitalize on that should that come to bear. And I'm seeing Steve McNulty shake his head up and down, and I think those linkages to, for instance, the Southeast Climate Hub will be very important for sort of continuing that and making some of those tools available should they become more important. The final thing we asked about, or that we're going to report on here, are there barriers or limitations in your organization that you see to adopting any of this information? So we tried to sort of identify some things that might make it difficult for organizations to sort of capitalize on some of this information. Things like limited incentives to capitalize on the information, limited organizational consideration, maybe your organization doesn't care, limited organizational investment in training, and so on. So these are sort of capacity or structural things that might limit adoption or participation in some of these. And I think it's good news that really very few of these were identified as being significant barriers. I think obviously for some of the non-corporate folks, it appears that some of the financial incentive pieces, as I mentioned before, might be a limiting factor. And I think that's not terribly surprising. But I think this slide is good news. I think there's a perception among our stakeholders that there are not strong institutional barriers to capitalizing on some of the things that will be coming out of PINEMAP, and I think that's a really good thing. So I think we want to move on from that and start getting some feedback from folks in terms of thinking about these research priorities. How do some of these things that have been identified in these survey instruments, how do they meet the needs of your organization, especially obviously with regard to climate and management of planted pine? With the idea, obviously, that we're operating in this context of doing some very specific things that NIFA asked us to do, but given that, does this survey reflect what you think are priorities for your organization? If not, are there additional climate-related research priorities that your organization might have, or other, pressing productivity-related research that you see as maybe being an important niche for PINEMAP in terms of what we could deliver to you? So I wanted to start out with sort of our primary respondees. I think we'll start with Marshall Jacobson and ask him to give us his thoughts on these questions, and then we'll move on to Wib Oam, and then we'll sort of open it up to the wider stakeholder group.
Great. Nothing like being first. Just a couple of comments right up front on the objectives of the whole project that we've had some pause to think about at Plum Creek. If you do a survey of folks right now, you tend to always want to reduce energy, and we always want to reduce fertilizer. But I'm not sure everybody knows why. There's some folks sitting in this room. I see Tim Allbaugh sitting over there. For every ton of carbon we spend creating, producing, applying fertilizer, we probably sequester somewhere between 15 and 25 tons. So aren't we backwards? We need to think about some of those issues, which will actually come around to one of my comments later. The 15% increase in sequestration, I'm looking at the genetics people, I'm saying, well, that's in the bag, but it all depends on how you account for it. We can grow a lot more, but if we cut it faster, we might end up at the same point. So understanding what some of those objectives are is a pretty big deal. At Plum Creek, kind of two things my job is. Productivity on one hand, risk on the other, and all that based on some sort of financial return. So I'm looking at the results in the first area. 91% of the corporate folks said productivity. Not a big surprise. With these objectives in mind, I think maybe the other side, the public side, might get a little more enticed in thinking productivity might have something to do with climate change. Timber supply, 79%. Well, that's great. We all love timber supply, but all the industry is not going to cooperate a whole lot in looking at it because all that stuff's sort of proprietary. I mean, we have FIA, we have SOFAC, we have a number of places that we do. If we get any further into that in research, we won't play because that's our business. But it's always high on the research side. Land values, that's a big deal for a TIMO or a REIT. We're buying and selling land all the time. So understanding the value of the property, certainly a big deal. Risk came up at 64%. That's a pretty big deal. We have lots of risk, but changes in management with extremes and weather, we were down at 34% on that one. And that's just the life we live. My company has 4.5 million acres or so in the south. We have a tornado every year. We have lightning strikes every year. We have bug outbreaks every year. We have invasive species. And then we have the year where we have 4 hurricanes in 1 year in Florida. So we just kind of live that. A little change in the frequency, we might not even notice. It's a big reactionary item for us. More specific on the research side, I guess I'm not too surprised the 2 top topics dealt with genetics. That's a big deal. We can do fertilizer and we can control weeds and everything, but we still have a lot of opportunity in genetics. In Plum Creek, we're everywhere from Texas to Virginia. So Paul has his hands full every year on deployment issues. So we look at deployment based on weather, based on disease, based on soil. We're looking at temperature and rainfall issues and all of that. So understanding that going down the road is a really big deal. Silviculture techniques. There are those that think we know everything. We're not that good. For those of you that know me, I'm much more interested in the physiology side and hang around with Tim and Rodney and Lisa and Bob and try to understand how trees grow, and we still don't know everything. Sanitation cuts, that was an interesting one for me because it's at 29%. Well, if we get a bug outbreak, we do it. We don't need research in it. It's a pretty big risk, so we just kind of head on off there. But that's a big deal, working with us and public agencies taking care of that. Modeling, I think the first one there had to do with assessing, and I just wrote down it's not really a research topic because we're already kind of doing that. So it's not a big area for us to look at research. Participating in carbon markets, I probably voted no on that one, and it ranked very low, and that's because it had carbon markers. If it had simply said understanding the entire carbon issues with management, I would have put it very high. It's a big deal to the corporate world. Anybody that works, sustainability is huge, carbon footprints are huge. Wood is good, you all know that, but we need to make a bigger deal about that sort of thing. Assessments and modeling. Let's see. I guess I'll just jump down to barriers. We don't see huge barriers, but we get lots of questions. It doesn't take, the last IPCC report came out, and what hit the news was something that referenced IPCC, but IPCC never said it. So it said, the trees are going to die, basically. I mean, it was just kind of a bad article. And we need to understand the science behind that and make sure we know. But when an article like that comes out, my corporate office and every company's corporate office gets questions from investors, which quickly go to our legal counsel. Should we reassess our risk and understanding that? So getting between what makes the news and real science is kind of a big deal to us. So we need to be able to do that, keep ourselves confident and make sure our stockholders are confident. Well, I think that's what I got, Tim.
Thanks, Marshall. Okay, Webb works with the Southern Group of State Foresters. Go ahead, Webb.
Well, thanks for having me, and glad to have the opportunity to address this group. I was first introduced to PINEMAP, I guess a few months ago at a meeting that Bill Hubbard hosted over here at Flinchams, Phoenix. And a couple presentations there, and my first impression was it was named wrong. It should have been named Loblolly Map. And I told the group that. So obviously those presentations hit home the point that most of the research was aimed at loblolly, whereas I'm representing state forestry agencies across the southeast who are working with declining species, and longleaf and shortleaf have declined tremendously over the years because of the increased emphasis on loblolly. So that that was one of the things that really, in my mind, needed to be addressed. And I think it is. I think there's a lot of things that are going on in the background, but the message didn't come across that way. So we've done a great job of, over the years with research on loblolly, and we've pushed that information through our field foresters out to private landowners. And the results have been tremendous. We've got a lot of great stands that have been planted out there. But like I said, it's been at the expense of longleaf and shortleaf, and we're turning that around a little bit. We've started to do more research on longleaf, and we're learning more about that species, and we're training our foresters on getting that message out to private landowners and moving that direction. And shortleaf is following in the wings similarly. So that's one of the big things that I see that we need to do. We need to focus on catching those other pine species up, and there are some locally important pine species all across the southeast that may fall into that category. When we work with private landowners, I always wanted my my field foresters to give them the options. What are your objectives? And once they find out the landowner's objectives, then here's your options. Let them know that they want to plant pines. Here's the pine species we've got. Here's what each one will do for you. And let them make a decision based on what the information we're given. And I'm not so sure that we've done that over the years. I think, like I said, we're getting that direction. Those are the main things that I see right now, and it's an idea of paying attention to the sites and what's important, what that site is dictating that you might want to be planting on, and using that information to guide us. Thanks again.
Thanks, Webb. Those both are great sets of feedback, and I really appreciate that. I want to open it up to other stakeholders that might have thoughts on any of these questions. Don't be intimidated by Marshall and Webb. All right. There'll be plenty of opportunities as we move forward. Wendy Lynn always tells me that you should be comfortable using silence as a tool, and I'm not going to put that on you yet, but I will. I can do that. And so I really appreciate the feedback. I think Webb makes a really good point in terms of always keeping in mind that intensive loblolly pine management in the southeast is critical to the region, but it happens within the context, a much larger context of forest management that includes obviously much more than loblolly pine plantation. So I think we certainly are aware of that, and you'll see some elements where we try to back up to 30,000 feet and think about what the larger forest context is. And I think it really is important to never forget that. And I think, again, moving forward beyond PINEMAP into search, I hope that we can sort of leverage much of what we've learned in PINEMAP to understand how to best manage all pines and all forests given uncertainties, how to take advantage of opportunities there might be with changing climate, and to mitigate any risks that might be associated with changing climate as well. So thank you very much, folks. So let's go ahead and move on. We'll capitalize. We're actually slightly ahead, so we'll go ahead and jump into some science presentations. And like I mentioned before, these science presentations are focused on some pretty large integrative things that are happening in the project and are things that we hope will sort of guide us directly towards some of those outcomes. So we're going to have Ryan Boyles talking about some of the really state-of-the-art climate projections that we're going to be working with in order to do climate change research, you have to have the best information in terms of what you expect to happen in the future. And thanks to Ryan and his climatologist colleagues, we really do have the best available climate data. They literally have been streaming in over the last few months. This is really new and good stuff. So Bob Teskey is going to then talk about some of the management scenarios. When we're thinking about models and projecting what's going to happen in the future, we need to think about how climate is going to change in the future. We need to think about what land is going to be in pine and how that land is going to be managed. Is it going to be managed intensively or more extensively? What kinds of risks are going to be out there and so on. So we need to have a framework of scenarios that help to guide the modeling so that we can create these different worlds to look at to hopefully help guide then what some of the lower risk paths into the future are. And so Bob Teskey is going to talk about the development of some of those modeling scenarios. Randy Wynn is going to bear on his shoulders the work of a very large number of people in terms of talking about our regional modeling. And as I mentioned before, regional modeling is really central to what we're doing. And he's going to summarize where that work is, sort of the parameters. He'll introduce you to the suite of models that we're using in PINEMAP and why we chose the models we do. And he has some very exciting, hot off the presses, regional simulations of productivity in southern pine. It's still preliminary work, but it's very interesting. So when I first saw what they're working on and saw where they are, I got pretty excited. And I think these models are really a resource for the community. The simulations are going to be really important for what we do. And I think those models and the data sets we're assembling will continue to be resources for the community even beyond PINEMAP. So I'm really excited about all of that as well. Ryan Boyles will get up again and will summarize some of the work we're doing on the PINEMAP decision support system. One of the key ways that we plan to make our work available to stakeholders is through a web-based decision support system. And Ryan is going to highlight sort of how that decision support system is structured, what kind of information and tools might be going into it, and how that interface might work. And then Martha Monroe will wrap up and talk about some of PINEMAP's graduate education. As you saw in one of the slides I showed, we have about 57 graduate students at 11 different institutions across the Southeast. And a real challenge we faced at the start of this project was, this is a great resource we have. We have all of these students working on diverse projects, but all sort of with a common focus. What can we do to provide some sort of thread that runs through all of these students' programs that will add value to what they're doing, that will enable them to sort of walk away with something more than just doing a research project? They'll be able to walk away and say, hey, I was involved in a 5-year, $20 million project, and here's the value added I got from that. And a big part of that was some of these graduate education things that we did in PINEMAP. And I'm proud of them, and Martha's going to summarize some of those.